I feel like I do everything on YouTube that you're not supposed to do when it comes to making video content, but I focus a little bit more on just raw messaging instead of the theatrics. And then on top of that, I just am treating an ear infection right now, and we're gonna lay sideways so I can let these eardrops sink in a little bit for about 10 minutes. So this is gonna be your video for the day. But side note, I channeled a message about resentment and unforgiveness, and how it has everything to do with your boundaries and not necessarily so much to do about your emotional inability to get over something. So, one very cool download I received from Spirit was that resentment and unforgiveness is a codependent or an unhealed empath's way to put up an energetic barrier towards someone they care about when they cannot put up the physical barrier. And what do I mean by that? So, a lot of people have trouble forgiving, and I've had trouble forgiving. I hold on to things, or at least have in the past. I've gotten a lot better at it with age, but there's still things that were stuck. And I asked Source why this happens. And what I got back was the fact that it's more or less a defense mechanism. So you don't act in the world in a way that is not equivalent to your desire and your self-love and your spirit. So when you're codependent or when you're an unhealed empath, you love to the point of self-sacrifice, or even some people, when you talk about concepts like limerence, it's loving to the point of obsession or infatuation, which is actually a counterfeit version of love. And so is being a codependent or unhealed empath. It is not actually love, and it is the closest counterfeit version that you implement in the world when you are unhealed, at least on the spectrum of over loving somebody. And when you're more on that spectrum, what happens is you don't have the stop button or the pause button when it comes to the action of love or the feeling of love towards somebody in a moment where it would be inappropriate, or maybe not inappropriate, but it would be non-conducive to your spirit and your well-being to continue to love or continue to show the action of love towards somebody. But as codependents and unhealed empaths, we often lack boundaries and lack identity. And resentment and unforgiveness is a way to put up a barrier to stop us when we don't know how to stop. So what do I mean by that? What happens in this situation is it's basically over love. And it's like as soon as the machine starts going for us, we don't really have any control as far as turning it off when we should. Like, there is no off button. So resentment and unforgiveness is the off button that you're kind of just holding down in place of boundaries and strong identity. It's a symptom of having identity weakness and boundary weakness, because when you come from these types of backgrounds, you're typically taught that your self or the self doesn't matter, and that all of your energy is supposed to be directed towards the outside world. So this will happen a lot if you had narcissistic parents or abusive parents or whatever, or you had to be parental in the situation where you were a child. So many different things. But what you learn to do is sacrifice your boundaries and sacrifice your identity of the self in favor of appeasing the desires or the self of another person. And you're essentially programming your 3D body to say, or just programming your ego, or whatever it is that you call it, to say the self does not matter, but you matter instead. So when you get into loving situations, this is what you do. All of your over love goes towards them, and it depletes you because you've never been trained to have the boundaries of loving yourself first and then loving another person second in a way that maintains both. And typically you'll give to the point of depletion. So when you have not learned the skill to stop loving, or when you haven't learned the skill to put up a boundary, what you do is learn to hate the person or learn to hate what they did and hold on to that hate, because it is the only stopping mechanism you have available. So a lot of people, because we are designed to love, and we're designed to love in a healthy way, because a lot of people do not have that boundary as a quote unquote loving person, which codependency is not actually love, but because we feel it as love and feel it as overgiving, we don't have that mechanism. And then as human beings, if all of us were healed and the world was ideal, we are not programmed initially to have a stop button on love. It's not meant to be something that you control. It's not meant to be something that is turned off. It's supposed to be something that's flowing infinitely once it starts. And that is what God does. And as humans, once you enter a damaged world, even if you have real love for somebody, because real love, real authentic love is supposed to be infinitely flowing and it's not in its nature to stop flowing, we often create a negative emotion to cover that in order to stop the flow to the point of our detriment. So it's a safety mechanism. And the reason a lot of people, even with time or even with other types of healings, will still have some kind of resentment or unforgiveness, it's because of identity weakness and boundary weakness in that sense. So it's not only just learning the stop button, but also having the self-esteem or the strong identity or strong identity frame tied to it to where you can act on that self-esteem with boundaries. So you have to learn the stopping mechanism, and you have to be strong enough to want to implement that stopping mechanism when something becomes unhealthy for you. So what we're actually doing when we don't have that skill is putting up hate as a drain stopper in its place. And that is what unforgiveness is. At its heart, unforgiveness is holding negative emotion towards somebody. That's why they say it's like drinking a poison and hoping the other person dies, because what you're doing is intaking constant negative energy in regards to that person, because that is the only thing that will create an energetic wall from you going and loving them in a way that was unhealthy for you. And then even if they're not part of your life anymore, it's a way to separate your mind and your mentality from the feeling of love. That way you can function in other areas and devoting the mental energy and the mental love towards that person. So this can happen energetically, and this can happen in 3D as well. But essentially what you're doing is using that negative emotion that you're forcing yourself to feel towards them, as a drain stopper. And the only way to really undo that is to learn how to be that drain stopper yourself, which again is learning boundaries. And I wouldn't even stop there. Another really big key factor is to have the strength of identity and a strong frame when you operate in the world, which is your self-esteem. And then add that to the boundaries, because without self-esteem, you can learn as many boundaries as you want, you're never going to implement them. You can have the intelligence and the wherewithal and the knowledge to know what you should do, but if you still feel compelled by your emotions, namely the fear that somebody might leave you, because fear of abandonment is very strong in people who come from codependent and unhealed empath backgrounds. If you don't solve that, which is a self-esteem issue, and the idea that without you I am nothing, so that is saying that your frame is weak, you have to go through and solve those problems first. And then you'll realize you'll become more comfortable with people not being a part of your life and not holding on to them energetically in that negative way. And then forgiveness, resentment, and bitterness becomes much easier to overcome.